Tonight we're beginning a brand new book. Last week we looked at all the background information. Tonight we're going to jump in to the book itself, and we're going to focus on chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And the story of Esther is an incredible story. It's a story of a Jewish woman living not in the land of Israel, but living in the land of the Persians in one of their capital cities. And just the life that she lived, the things that she experienced, and the fact that she's able to put her own life on the line to save her people. An incredible story of bravery and courage. It's also an amazing story because God is not mentioned in the book. You know, you would think if there's a book in the Bible, it ought to say something about God, after all, since it's in the Bible. But the name God is not mentioned in this book, not even one single time. In fact, there's no evidence in this book that anyone even prays. We may think they did at certain times, but there's no record of it. And at the same time, this story is just an incredible story. It's a story of faithfulness, courage, irony, and surprises. And we're going to look at one of those surprises tonight. And yet, by the time we get to the end of the book, our conclusion is that the unmentioned God is behind it all. God was moving things and orchestrating things and working through circumstances, working through people, just like He still does today. And you've probably had an experience in life when you wondered, where's God? You know, I'm going through this situation. Where's God in all of this? And then when you finally get through the situation, you look back and go, oh, He was there the whole time. I just didn't recognize Him at the moment. So this is a story that resonates with us because we can see God working through circumstances and people in our lives as well. Well, the story begins with King Xerxes, who's the king of the Persian Empire. And he's going to give a banquet. And during the banquet, something's going to happen between the king and the queen. And the queen's going to have to be replaced. And this will open the door for Esther to enter the story. And it also, as we look at this story tonight, will give us some clues, some background information of the life that Queen Esther is stepping into. Not necessarily an easy life. But we'll discover that, which gives rise to her courage, her bravery, especially knowing what happened to the previous queen. So it's an incredible story that we're going to begin tonight. And it's interesting that in the book of Esther, most of the decisions, most of the story centers around a banquet. Yes, the Persians love to party. Now, Baptists love to eat, but Persians love to party. And most of these parties, don't admit it if you were there, but these are like frat parties. You know, where the guys get together in a frat party and do crazy and stupid things. That pretty much describes the banquets of the Persian Empire. So as we follow the banquets, we follow the story. In fact, in tonight's verses, there are perhaps as many as 3 different banquets that take place. And interesting decisions are made in each of these banquets. Well, let me read verses 1 through 12, which are the verses we're going to talk about tonight. And then we'll break down these verses and talk about the story. It begins in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, He displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Well, the story's off to a great start already, as we can see. A lot of things taking place, and it begins with the historical setting. And the historical setting lets us know this is not a fairy tale. This is not just a novel that somebody came up with. It wasn't that an author sat under a tree one day and said, I want to write an interesting story. No, this is a true story, something that actually happened that the author is talking about. And it all begins in verse 1 with, this is what happened. That phrase was very common among Hebrew writers. When they wanted to tell a story, they would begin by saying, this is what happened, or this is what took place. Now, it sounds a lot like Once Upon a Time, but Once Upon a Time normally introduces a fairy tale. This is what happened, or this is what took place, introduces a true story. And the story is about King Xerxes. Xerxes happens to be his Greek name. Ahasuerus happens to be his Hebrew name. So every time you take a name and put it in a different language, you end up with a different name. The Persian name could be something like Shearsha, was his Persian name. He was the son of Darius, who happened to be Darius the Great, who was a great leader of the Persian Empire. His mother's name was Atosa, and she was the daughter of Cyrus, and Cyrus was the first emperor of the Persian Empire. So Xerxes comes from some very royal blood. So he was very privileged growing up in that kind of setting, and his father leaves him with an extensive empire. In fact, it's said that it extended all the way from India to Kush. India was the territory that was drained by the Indus River. It was modern-day Pakistan is basically what it was. And then Kush was Ethiopia, or the territory south of Egypt, in the northern part of modern Sudan. It was the largest empire on record at that time. In fact, I have a picture of it. So it goes all the way from the Indus River, which is down here by India, and the other reference was south of Egypt, down here in Kush or Ethiopia. Now, being Jewish in origin of the book, Jerusalem is here, and Judea is right in this area. So you can tell that the land of Israel is just a little tiny part of this vast empire that's all outlined in green. So this is a huge empire that King Xerxes inherits, and he's to rule over this entire area. It also says that there are 127 provinces. Now, in the Persian Empire, it was divided into satrapies, and a satrap was over these different regions. And according to Darius, there were 20 such areas where there was a satrap ruling over them. So he had it divided into 20 regions. But this talks about 127 provinces, which were probably major cities that were smaller, obviously, than the areas that the satrap would rule over. So this was very well organized into 20 different sections, and there were 127 major cities, and those probably varied from time to time. Some of them were won in battle, others were lost in battle. But one of the things about King Xerxes was he so much wanted to expand this empire. I mean, he's already got this huge empire, but he wanted it to be bigger, but he never succeeded. In fact, King Xerxes is known for two things in history. One is his defeat at the hands of the Greeks, and the other is the building of a Persian palace at Persepolis. Now, in 481 BC, after he had been in office for about 5 years, he decides he wants to attack the Greeks because they had defeated his father, Darius, at the Battle of Marathon. The Greeks won that battle. And Xerxes so much wanted to defeat the Greeks, to take away that stench from his father, that he actually lost a battle. So he wanted to defeat the Greeks. But the Greeks were growing in power. And Xerxes is going to attack them. But he's going to lose. The Greeks are going to win one more time. So, here's a man with a great ego, wanting to expand the empire. But he's never quite able to do that. Well, as we move on to verse 2, we find out that he's reigning from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And again, Susa is the Greek name. Shushan happens to be the Hebrew name. Now, Darius the Great rebuilt this city, and he loved to be in Susa during the winter time, but not during the summertime, which is the way a lot of people feel about the state of Florida. You know, it's a great place to be in the winter, but it's just too hot in the summertime. So if you can imagine Florida without air conditioning, that's kind of the way Susa was in the summertime. It got very, very hot. So most of the times the emperors went to Persepolis during the summertime, and they went to Susa during the winter time. So the story picks up, so it has to be sometime during the winter because Xerxes is located in Susa. There are actually 4 capitals of the Persian Empire, not just one, and they are all on this map. This is Persepolis down in the south. Then a little bit north is Susa, and then there's Babylon, and then there's a town called Ecbatana, which was also a capital city. So this empire is so big that it needs 4 different capitals, and chances are the emperors moved from capital city to capital city, depending upon what was taking place in the empire. It's called the Citadel of Susa. It's an acropolis. And back in the ancient world, in order to protect the palace, you would build it higher than anything else. So if you could build it on a hill, so much the better. Because back then people fought basically with swords and bows and arrows, and the higher up you were, the more protected that you were. So the citadel of Susa was actually 72 feet higher than the normal land. So they're up there 72 feet, and if you were living in the city of Susa, you would look up, and there was the palace, this beautiful palace that Xerxes was living in. And so it was very defensible, because if somebody tried to attack you coming up a hill, well, you could shoot arrows at them and throw things at them and distract them and keep them from attacking you or defeating you. So in the ancient world, the Acropolis, you build things higher. When it says the citadel of Susa, it's a reference to the king's palace and those who live in the palace and around the palace and who serve the king. There was also the city of Susa, but it's different from the citadel of Susa. The city of Susa existed first, and then the citadel was built later. So when it mentions the citadel of Susa, it's the palace. It's where the king lives. It's where the king's servants live as well. Verse 3 says that in the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes started his reign in 486 BC. We're now talking about 483 BC. And he gives a banquet for all the nobles and officials. It's the military leaders who are invited to this great banquet. Why the banquet? Well, King Xerxes is putting together a military campaign to attack the Greeks. And he wants all of the military people to come to this great banquet so he can share with them his great idea of how he's going to attack and defeat the Greeks. So he needs their support. He needs them to raise up a huge army that he can take into battle in order to win. And according to the Greek historian Herodotus, Xerxes works on his battle plan for 4 years before finally attacking the Greeks. And the way things turned out, maybe he should have spent another year on his battle plan, because his battle plan doesn't work. Ancient rulers would often use banquets to get support from the people. And in this case, he invites the elite people, the elite military people, to this banquet. And when they come to the banquet, they see all the glory and majesty of the king and what the king has built. And the king can say, I can do something for you if you'll do something for me. And I want you to raise up a great army among your people. And again, there's 20 different regions to the Persian Empire. And he needs to unite them to come up with this great army to attack the Greeks. So if you'll do that for me, look at all the wealth I have. I can do something for you in return. So they throw this great banquet in order to get the support of the people. There's also a mention of the Persians and the Medes. And this empire is often called the Persian-Median Empire. Now, the Persians and the Medes are two separate groups. They are ethnically related, and up until the time of Cyrus, they had an uneasy history with one another. In fact, the Medes, their greatest accomplishment is that they joined up with the Babylonians to defeat the Assyrians. And up until the time of Cyrus, the Medes were actually the stronger of the two groups. But Cyrus found a way to unite the Medes and the Persians, because his father was a Persian and his mother was a Mede. So he basically forced the two groups to come together and form this great empire. And since that time, it was always called the Persian and the Medes Empire. So both groups were involved, but after Cyrus, the Persians were the stronger hand of the two groups. So that's a brief look at the historical background. And so Esther is going to eventually find her way into this Persian Empire, where Xerxes is the emperor. And wow, at Susa, it's an incredible place. In fact, we're going to see in the next section the majesty of the king. Now, it's not that Xerxes achieved all of this. He was given this. His predecessors had formed an incredible empire. In fact, Cyrus conquered Babylon. And if you know anything about the book of Daniel, that was written during the days of the Babylonian Empire. And the amount of gold that was in Babylon was incredible. And the Persians conquered Babylon, so they took all the gold. Then Cambyses conquered Egypt, and Egypt was known for its wealth as well. So now you have all the wealth of Babylon and all the wealth of Egypt. You've got a great empire. And then we come up with Darius, and he conquers India in the Indus River. So he expands the empire. He also organizes the empire. And now Xerxes gets to inherit all of that. He's got so much wealth, he doesn't know what to do with all of it. So that brings us to the majesty of the king. Now, if you were a common person living in the Persian Empire, well, you made enough money that you could survive. You could eat, you could have a modest place to live, and you could get by. But if you were part of the royal palace, if you were part of the king's people, you got to live in the land of luxury. And that's what we find in verse 4. We find the ridiculous nature of the wealth that Xerxes has. And Xerxes loved to show off his wealth. You might say that Xerxes had an ego that was as big as the Persian Empire. And he loved to invite people to come and visit and see his wealth. And in verse 4, he puts on an exposition of his wealth for all the military leaders scattered throughout the Persian Empire to come to Susa and see the majesty of the king. It says for a full 180 days. Now, he doesn't put on a banquet for a half a year. But for a half a year, he invites various people at various times to come to Susa to look at the wealth and examine the beauty. So eventually he can say to them, join my military campaign, and I'll share some of my wealth with you. That's his strategy. So with a big ego and a lot of money, he puts on quite a show that lasts for 180 days. He displays the vast wealth of the kingdom, the splendor and glory of his majesty. And if you came as a military leader, you would go, wow, this guy is filthy rich. Oh, and if I join his military campaign and we win, he's going to share some of that with me. I might like a little bit of that wealth. And that was the strategy of Xerxes. So when those days were over, when that half year of displaying his wealth was over, he's going to present another banquet. And this banquet's going to last for 7 days. You know, it's interesting that, we say that Americans love to party. They can't keep up with the Persians. I mean, the Persians have a banquet. It's not for 1 day. It's for a whole week. They just party for a week. We can't do that in America. We got to go to work. We've got responsibilities. We got things to do. But in the ancient world, well, they love to party. So this is a banquet that lasts 7 days. It's held in the palace garden, and it's for all the people, from the least to the greatest, in the citadel of Susa. And again, these are people who work for the king. The least would be the servants. The greatest would be some of the royal officials. And the king invites everybody because he wants everybody in the palace and the surrounding area to be on board when he announces his military campaign to go out and defeat the Greeks. So he gives this great banquet that's going to last for 7 whole days. Verse 6 talks a little bit about the lavish nature of what the king has to offer. In fact, the author seems to be overwhelmed with all that he sees, and these images of luxury are just piled on top of each other. White and blue, or perhaps violet, are the colors of the Persian Empire. The decor is fine linen with mosaic flooring of precious stones. The wealth of the king is displayed so that he can convince people to join the army and be under his command as he leads them out into battle. Look at what I can do for you. And then, wine was served in goblets of gold. Normally, it was goblets of metal and glass, but on special occasions, out comes the fine china. We do that sometimes. We have china in the closet, and, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, out comes the good stuff, served before the family and the guest. Well, out comes the goblets of gold. So you get to drink from a gold cup. And they probably stole those from Babylon. Babylon was famous for their gold goblets. But now the Persians own all of those, and they use them on special occasions. Royal wine was abundant. This was the best of the wine. Now, back in ancient times, everybody drank wine. It wasn't safe to drink just water, so they would drink wine. But if you mixed it 50-50 with water, you would never get drunk. It would just be a nice beverage for your meal. But this was the royal wine. This was the wine that had fermented. This was the intoxicating wine. And it was the best wine that money could buy. And it's served up to whoever wants it. Because the king is being very liberal and generous with what he's doing. In fact, at this particular party, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. Sounds like a frat party to me. Normally, during these banquets, you would drink wine when the king would drink wine. So you would drink as much wine as the king. But you were not allowed to outdrink the king if the king had an ego about that. The king said, nobody can outdrink me. In fact, that's the rules. You're not allowed to outdrink the king. But in this party, you could. If you wanted to drink less wine than the king, that was okay. If you wanted to drink more, there was an open bar policy. Drink as much wine as you want. Yes, the king is certainly looking to gain support. And by giving people as much wine as they want, that was almost a surefire way to gain their support. So, this party turned into drunkenness and overindulgence. And it goes on for 7 days. The best of the food, the best of the wine. It is one crazy fraternity party. Sponsored by the king. Well, we turn to verse 9, which is the queen's banquet. And we find out that Queen Vashti gathers the women for a banquet as well. So the queen has at least enough authority and power to have her own banquet, which she puts on for the women of the palace. Her banquet was probably in the royal apartments there in the palace area. And there's a question about the queen's banquet. Why did she have a separate banquet? And the author really never answers that question. Could it be that there were so many people for the banquet that they decided between them, okay, Xerxes will host all the men, and Vashti will host all the women? Was it done because there just wasn't enough room in one area for everybody that they had to divide up? That's possible. Some have suggested that, maybe it was custom that the men and women would party separately. But according to Persian custom, no, the men and women could party together. In fact, Herodotus indicates that the kings and the nobles would often invite their wives to these banquets and parties. Could it be that Xerxes and Vashti had a disagreement? And Vashti said, okay, I'm just going to have my own banquet. Was there a bit of tension between the king and the queen before this banquet ever took place? Well, we don't know. But we do know that there's two banquets, and we're not really sure why, because Persian custom would require one banquet, not two. So she has her banquet as well, again in the royal palace of the king. Then we move on to this next section where the king's request is denied. Well, that almost seems like an oxymoron. If the king makes a request, it ought to be granted immediately. After all, he is the king. But his request will be denied. It takes place on the seventh day. The seventh day of the banquet. And by now, King Xerxes is in high spirits. He's been drinking for 7 straight days. There's been a lot of cheerfulness and a lot of drunkenness that has taken place. The king is at least slightly intoxicated, if not completely intoxicated, by this point. It's interesting that Herodotus, in talking about the Persian Empire, points out that the Persians would often make important decisions while they were drunk. And then they would reevaluate those decisions once they were sober again. So to make a major decision while intoxicated was part of the policy of the Persian Empire. Sounds like just a bunch of fraternity brothers getting together for a frat party that goes wild. And they make their own decisions, only to check them out later to make sure that they were good ones. Well, what does the king want? Well, he's going to command 7 eunuchs to do something for him. And it's interesting that during this time that eunuchs were highly valued for government service. And there was such a great demand for eunuchs that part of the tribute that some of these countries paid to Persia was to send young boys over to Persia who would then be castrated and trained in government service. There was such a need for them. Interesting way of doing business. These particular eunuchs were in charge of the royal harem. Their names are listed, all 7 of them, to indicate that this is a true story involving real people. And here's the name of the eunuchs. What are they supposed to do? They're to bring before the king Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown. So here's Xerxes with all the men, all the royal officials, all the people who work for him, and they've had 7 days of a great party. They've drunk themselves into a stupor, and now they want the queen to show up, wearing her royal crown. And the question is, what is he trying to do? It could be that he sends 7 eunuchs because he wants them to get the queen to come in wearing her royal crown and seated on a royal throne, which the 7 eunuchs would then carry into this banquet hall. And that would be a grand entrance. Here comes the queen, dressed in her royal crown, carried by 7 eunuchs. And perhaps the king is thinking that would inspire loyalty and patriotism for the Persian Empire if they could see the queen in that way. Well, since this is a Jewish book, the book of Esther, Jewish rabbis have for years debated about what's going on. Well, the king wants the queen to wear her royal crown, but the question is, what else is she wearing? And according to a lot of the Jewish rabbis, she wasn't wearing anything other than her royal crown. But others disagree, and they say that's not the issue. The issue is that in Persian culture, it was often that the royal women, their faces were not to be seen. And when they rode in carriages, they were covered so that the general population could not look in the carriage and get a view of the queen or other royal women. So according to many, this was not about modesty, it was about honor. And for Queen Vashti to show up with her face uncovered, being gawked at by hundreds of drunk men, that would bring shame to the office of the queen. That's another possibility. Well, verse 12 is the first surprise in the story. We find out in verse 12 that Queen Vashti refuses to come. She defies the king's order. Oh, who saw that one coming? I mean, she's the queen. She's supposed to do what the king wants. But she doesn't. She says no. And she refuses to come. Why? We're never told. We only know that she says no to the king. And who would dare to say no to the king? The queen. And the king, Xerxes, becomes furious. And he burns with anger. Is he angry because his wife just told him no? Or is he angry because his wife has now broken a Persian law and done something serious, that this is a serious offense? And I think the answer is yes to both. His wife has just said no to him. And that's a serious offense to say no to the king. So, here's King Xerxes. For 7 days, he puts on this incredible banquet for everyone who works for him. And he wants everyone who works for him to join him in this military campaign. And before that, for 180 days, he has shown off the lavish nature of the palace and the wealth, wanting every military leader in the Persian Empire to say yes to his campaign to go after the Greeks and avenge the loss that his father experienced. But now the question is, how can Xerxes lead an army when his own wife won't follow him? Talk about embarrassment. Maybe you've been in a situation where someone was trying to persuade others and all of a sudden somebody says something and everybody goes, "Oh, I can't believe she said that. Now what's the king going to do? I mean, this was going really well. But now everybody's uncomfortable. Everybody's sweating. Everybody's going, I kind of like the king. I feel a little embarrassed for him. Or, I didn't really like the guy to begin with. I'm glad somebody finally said no to him. This is an incredibly uncomfortable situation for the king and everybody else in the room. But you have to admire the courage of Vashti. I mean, we're not sure why she said no. Maybe it had something to do with morality and modesty. Maybe it had something to do with honor. And she wasn't about to cause dishonor to come to the position of the queen. For whatever reason, the woman was certainly brave. I mean, this is King Xerxes. He's the emperor of the Persian Empire. That vast, huge empire. And she has the audacity to tell him no. Wow. You have to give her credit. Perhaps she valued her dignity more than she valued her position as the queen. Surprise, surprise, surprise. But here's the deal, because we know that Esther will eventually walk into that kind of situation. Esther will walk into a situation where she's going to become the queen. And the king's got this huge ego. And the king doesn't like anybody saying no to him. And she's going to walk into that situation. And one day, she too will break protocol and do something she's not supposed to do. Taking a chance. Showing courage. Well, Vashti, Esther, women of courage. How about us? Are we people of courage? If somebody asks us to do something that we know is wrong or would cause us dishonor, would we say yes to them just because they had a higher position than we have? Or do we have enough courage and bravery to say, no, I'm not doing that? I mean, all the boys at the frat party, how many of them said, no, I'm not going to drink myself into a drunken stupor because that's stupid. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to maintain my dignity and honor even though everyone else is losing theirs right and left. No, I'm not going to lie for you just because you're my friend. I'm a person of truth. And if I lie for you and you get caught, I'm going to get caught too. Dignity, honor. As someone once said, how much will it take for you to lose your dignity? How much money will it take for you to sacrifice your dignity and honor? Vashti, Esther, women of courage, women of dignity. We could learn a couple of things from them. Well, now what's the king going to do? I mean, the king with the big ego, the king who is trying to convince everybody to come follow me, follow my campaign. Your own wife won't follow you. What are you going to do now? Well, we'll find out next week as we look at the rest of chapter 1. Heavenly Father, we learned a lot tonight about dignity, honor, courage, bravery, and to live for Jesus in our modern world. We could use some courage. We could use some bravery. To say, no, I'm not doing that because God says it's wrong. No, I'm not going to do that because it's not what God wants me to do. Father, may we learn to be people of courage, people of bravery, people who will not sacrifice just to fit in. We're not going to sacrifice the truth just because people don't want to hear the truth. So, Father, help us to stand up and be counted, just like Vashti did in this story. Father, give us that courage, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.